I forgot my driver's license at home, and when I returned, I heard a feminine voice seducing my husband. I decided to say nothing, and I turned pale when I discovered that the two of them were. True hell is not in the hereafter. There is no eternal fire or demons with tridents. Sometimes hell takes the form of a living room, an unannounced visit, a voice that never stops whispering in your ear that you are not enough. Veronica exhaled slowly, letting her head fall back against the chair's backrest. On the kitchen table, the dough for the pastries rested under a clean cloth, patiently rising, waiting to be baked. This was her only day off for the week, and she had planned it with meticulous precision. A calm afternoon, unhurried, enjoying the aroma of homemade bread that always reminded her of her childhood. The sound of the doorbell pierced the house like a gunshot. She remained motionless. She wasn't expecting anyone. She pursed her lips and turned her head towards the hallway, hoping Ricardo would handle whatever it was. From the living room, only the television could be heard, its volume high, immersing her husband in some action series. "Ricardo, can you get that?" Silence. She clicked her tongue and, wiping her hands on her apron, walked towards the door. When she opened it, discomfort struck her chest. There stood Mrs. Rosa, with her wool coat and her air of superiority, which seemed to say, "I've come to correct all your mistakes." And by her side, with a too-wide smile, was Marcella, the neighbor who always found an excuse to hover around her house. "My love," exclaimed her mother-in-law, entering without an invitation. "Don't tell me you weren't expecting me." Veronica took a second to respond. Annoyance accumulated in her throat like a stone. "I had no idea you would come." Mrs. Rosa advanced with the confidence of someone who knows her presence is not optional. Marcella followed her, eyeing every corner of the house as if she were scouting the terrain. "Oh, but it's so hot in here," complained the old lady, removing her coat and letting it fall on the back of the couch. "Why don't you open the windows?" Veronica felt her irritation grow. Not even 5 minutes had passed and she was already being told how to manage her own home. Ricardo, oblivious to everything, continued on the sofa, eyes glued to the screen. He didn't even stand up to greet his mother. "Aren't you going to get up, son?" He let out a tired sigh and paused the TV. "Mom, I didn't know you were coming." "If I had told you, surely you would have told me not to come," she responded with a victimized tone. "But now that I'm here, you could show a little more enthusiasm." Veronica felt discomfort cling to her skin. Mrs. Rosa had an impressive ability to turn any interaction into a chance for emotional manipulation. Marcella, oblivious to the tension, took a seat on the edge of the sofa. "Veronica, how lucky you are to have such a loving mother-in-law." The lady of the house pursed her lips. Loving. If the definition of love included belittling, criticizing, and making someone feel small, then yes, Mrs. Rosa was the personification of love. "Tell us, dear," said the old woman, addressing her, "what were you doing?" Veronica narrowed her eyes. "Baking pastries." "Ah, of course," her mother-in-law's voice took on a condescending tone. "That's why you look the way you do." The air became thick. "Excuse me, what?" Mrs. Rosa smiled venomously. "Don't take it the wrong way, dear, but if you keep eating so much bread, you're going to explode. Ricardo needs a presentable wife, someone who doesn't have, well, you know." "Someone who doesn't have what?" "Oh, Veronica, don't play dumb. I'm talking about cellulite, stretch marks, those extra pounds. It's not your fault. After 30, everything goes downhill." Ricardo said nothing. He didn't defend her. Veronica felt a burning rise up her throat. Marcella chuckled softly. "But Mrs. Rosa, Veronica is beautiful in her own way," she said with feigned sweetness. The disguised mockery was the last straw. She took a deep breath. If she exploded, it would give Mrs. Rosa exactly what she wanted, an excuse to play the victim and say that her daughter-in-law was hysterical. "I'm going to make some tea," she said, turning around. She entered the kitchen and closed her eyes. She wanted to scream. She wanted to break something. She took a deep breath. She approached the table and removed the cloth from the dough she had prepared with so much effort. It was ready to be worked on. The sound of footsteps alerted her. Mrs. Rosa entered the kitchen as if it were her own home. "You shouldn't take my words so to heart, dear. It's just advice." Veronica didn't answer. The mother-in-law looked at her with feigned compassion. "I'll help you finish this." Before she could stop her, the old woman reached out, tripped over the table, and knocked the bowl with the dough to the floor. The disaster was immediate. Sticky dough spread across the floor. Flour covering the countertop. Everything ruined. Veronica clenched her fists. "Oh, how clumsy I am," said Mrs. Rosa with a barely concealed smile. "Well, dear, you'll have to make another batch." Veronica's control broke. "Enough." Mrs. Rosa looked at her, feigning surprise. "What's wrong, dear? Get out of my kitchen." The old woman raised her hands in an offended gesture. "Ricardo, did you hear that? Your wife is throwing me out of her house." Ricardo appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who would rather be anywhere else. "Veronica, please." "No." "You know what? No more." She gave him the hardest look she had. "Do you want to know why I didn't tell you I was coming?" said Mrs. Rosa. "Because if I had, you would have made up an excuse not to receive me. And now I see I was right." Marcella appeared behind Ricardo, enjoying the show. Veronica didn't want to cry. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She turned around and left the kitchen. She locked herself in her room and felt the weight of humiliation on her chest. She had endured too much. Hell wasn't a punishment in the afterlife. It was this. A home where she never felt welcome. And deep down, she knew. If she didn't set a limit, this would never end. The room was dim. Outside, the night stretched on endlessly, weighing down on the city like a concrete slab. Veronica sat up in bed, her arms around her knees, feeling her heart pounding at her temples. The humiliation of the day still burned in her chest. Dinner was served, and the atmosphere was thick, as if every word hung in the air with a load of invisible poison. Donna Rosa settled into her chair with a triumphant smile, as if her daughter-in-law's discomfort were the real meal of the night. Marcella, with her demeanor of a silent observer, chewed on each word with a veiled smile, enjoying this spectacle of tension. Ricardo, as always, dodged the confrontation by burying his face in his plate. "Veronica, you should take better care of your appearance," Donna Rosa said in that sugary voice that actually cut like a razor. "That cellulite won't go away on its own." Marcella let out a stifled giggle, pretending to cover her mouth with her napkin. Ricardo swallowed, but said nothing. Veronica's world tilted. She couldn't remain silent any longer. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice tense. Donna Rosa held her gaze with the satisfaction of a predator who has caught its prey. "Don't get me wrong, daughter. I already told you that Ricardo would only be happier at home if you took better care of yourself." A void opened in her stomach. "And what does it matter to you if my husband is happy or not?" "Oh, please, Veronica. We all know men are visual. If you don't give them what they need at home, they'll look for it outside." Marcella shifted her gaze to her plate with a hidden smile. Veronica felt a heat rise to her skin. "So, you're implying that if Ricardo cheats on me, it would be my fault?" Donna Rosa let out an exaggerated sigh. "Don't put words in my mouth. But you know what they say, a neglected woman is an abandoned woman." Ricardo shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He didn't defend her. He didn't open his mouth to refute those poisonous words. He said nothing. A strange chill ran over his skin. Marcella picked up her wine glass and swirled it slowly, as if the conversation were something entertaining. Although, Veronica, you have nothing to worry about. Some men don't notice appearances. There are those who value other things in a woman, like attention, company, admiration. The words were spoken with an almost erotic slowness. Veronica felt the chair creak beneath her hands. What do you mean? Marcella gave him a sideways glance. Nothing, I was just thinking. Veronica's fork tore into the meat on her plate with a metallic screech. Silences are more lethal than words. Ricardo still said nothing. The rest of dinner passed with hostility wrapped in politeness. Donna Rosa talked about trivial things, about the neighbor who left her husband for a younger man, about how women had to know how to stay attractive to retain their husband's interest. Veronica stopped eating. She just stared at the edge of her plate, feeling an idea settle in her mind like a cold, poisonous shadow. If Donna Rosa didn't stop, she would have to stop it somehow. She couldn't continue allowing that woman to drag her down in her own home, to sow doubt in her husband's mind, to strip her of her dignity with every word. She couldn't stand it any longer. But how do you stop someone like Donna Rosa? When dinner was over, Veronica cleared the dishes, her head filled with dark thoughts. Every place setting she piled in the sink sounded like a sentence. That night, she got into bed with tense muscles. Ricardo tried to hug her, but she rolled over without a word. The silence was an abyss. As soon as she closed her eyes, sleep swept her away. The house was dark, darker than usual. The lights seemed to be out, as if someone had stolen the electricity from the air. A disturbing chill crept across her skin. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy. A soft sound, like a whisper. Her eyes snapped open. Donna Rosa was standing in the doorway of the room. Veronica's stomach tightened. The old woman didn't move, but she was smiling. It wasn't the usual condescending smile. It was something darker. In her right hand, a knife gleamed in the reflection of the dim streetlight coming through the window. Veronica wanted to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. Donna Rosa took a step forward. Another. The knife's edge gleamed with every movement. "You're no good for Ricardo," she whispered in a raspy voice. "You never were." Veronica felt her legs give out. Her mother-in-law leaned over her. The knife rose. The blade swung down with a swift motion. El grito ahogado de Veronica estalo en la habitación. Abrió los ojos. Todo estaba en su lugar. La oscuridad, la cama, la ventana. No había nadie en la puerta. No había cuchillo. Solo su propia respiración agitada llenando el espacio. Se llevó una mano al pecho, sintiendo el latido frenético de su corazón. No era real. No era real. Pero su piel decía otra cosa. Se giró lentamente, encontrando la silueta de Ricardo durmiendo a su lado, ajeno a todo. Su mente lo enviaba señales de alerta. La pesadilla había sido demasiado vívida, demasiado precisa. Como si no fuera solo un sueño. Como si su propio subconsciente estuviera intentando advertir algo. Los mitos enterrados tienen la mala costumbre de crecer en la oscuridad. Y en esa casa, la oscuridad es cada vez más profunda. Veronica's mind was a battlefield. The echo of the nightmare still thudded in her chest like a war drum. The image of Mrs. Rosa at the door, holding the knife with that twisted smile, wouldn't dissipate. She knew it had been a dream, but something inside her whispered that it wasn't just a manifestation of her subconscious. It was a warning. Her instinct murmured that the shadows surrounding her were not mere nighttime illusions. She got out of bed noiselessly. Ricardo was still asleep, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. She watched him for a few seconds. His breathing was calm, as if the world wasn't falling apart around him. Frustration built up in her chest. How could he remain so indifferent to everything? To his mother, to the insults, to the daily humiliation she endured. He never defended her, never set boundaries. She stepped into the shower and let the water run over her body, trying to wash away the knot in her throat. Her reflection in the mirror stared back coldly. Mrs. Rosa's words continued to drill into her mind. Cellulite. Stretch marks. Extra pounds. Ricardo needs a presentable wife. She bit her lip until she tasted the metallic flavor of blood. She couldn't go on like this. She dressed listlessly and grabbed her purse. It was early, but leaving the house seemed like the only way to breathe. She hurried down the stairs and walked to the parking lot. She got into the car, threw her head back, and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her breathing. Then she felt it. An emptiness in her purse. She abruptly opened her eyes and searched desperately. The keys. The license. She had left them at home. A shiver ran through her skin. She didn't want to go back. She didn't want to return to that suffocating space where Mrs. Rosa and her toxicity contaminated everything. But she had no choice. She got out of the car and walked briskly back to the building. She climbed the steps with her heart pounding in her ears. Her hand trembled slightly as she turned the doorknob. She entered stealthily, without making a sound, as if her own home had become enemy territory. The sound of voices floated in the air. She stopped dead in her tracks. At first, she thought Ricardo was talking on the phone, but she soon recognized the second voice. Marcella. She pressed herself against the hallway wall, squinting her eyes. The neighbor's voice was soft, almost a whisper, with that sugary tone she always used when trying to be charming. Your mom told me you're stuck in a passionless marriage. Veronica's body tensed. That's not true, Ricardo responded nervously. Are you sure? You deserve better. The air thickened. Veronica stepped forward and peered through the crack in the door. Marcella was sitting on the edge of the couch, leaning slightly toward Ricardo. Her hand brushed his arm with feigned innocence. Her attire was a provocation in itself, a silk negligée that barely covered her skin. The thin straps left her shoulders bare, and the edge of the fabric just grazed the upper part of her thighs. Ricardo was stiff, staring at some point on the floor, avoiding eye contact. I don't know what my mom told you, but You don't need to say anything, Ricardo. I can read between the lines. Marcella slowly stood up and circled him like a hunter stalking her prey. Women like Veronica don't understand the needs of a man like you. Veronica felt her blood boil. Her own home, her own husband, her own neighbor, and her mother-in-law operating from the shadows. Marcella leaned in and ran her fingers through Ricardo's nape, letting her lips linger dangerously close to his ear. I do care about how you feel. Veronica felt a deadly chill run through her body. Pain burned her skin like acid. Betrayal had a bitter taste in her mouth. But she wasn't going to make a scene. She wouldn't give them the pleasure of seeing her lose control. She took a deep breath and entered the room with firm steps. Well, what an interesting proposal, Marcella. Why don't we have some tea and discuss it together? Time seemed to freeze. Marcella turned pale. Ricardo was paralyzed. The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Veronica kept her head high. I mean, if we're talking about what my husband deserves, I'd like to be part of the conversation. Marcella straightened up suddenly and pulled her hand away from Ricardo as if it burned. Veronica, Just what? She asked softly, but with the look of a storm about to break. Just trying to do me a favor? Just making sure my husband is well taken care of? Marcella pressed her lips together. Don't take things out of context. Veronica crossed her arms. Oh, really? Then explain the context to me. Marcella swallowed hard. Ricardo opened his mouth but found no words. This isn't what it looks like. Veronica let out a cold laugh. Oh, really? Then what is it? Couples therapy? Marital advice? Or were you just following the orders of your new best friend, Mrs. Rosa? Shame began to color Ricardo's face. Marcella stepped back, looking for an exit. Look, I don't have to explain anything, she said tensely. I just came to talk to Ricardo because I was concerned. Oh, sure. What a kind neighbor. Always ready to help. Marcella gritted her teeth. Veronica didn't let her escape. If you have something to say it to my face. Silence. No? What a pity. Marcella looked at Ricardo for help, but he remained silent. Veronica slowly approached until she was just a few inches from the neighbor. I don't want to see you near my house again. Marcella averted her gaze, but Veronica wasn't finished. And if I catch you insinuating yourself to my husband again, I assure you that the next conversation won't be so polite. Marcella tensed up, but said nothing. She turned around and left the house quickly. The sound of the door closing echoed in the air. Absolute silence. Veronica slowly turned towards Ricardo. Her husband swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on her like a child caught in a lie. Veronica, I didn't. She raised a hand. I don't want to hear it. But, no. The words hung between them. The silence said it all. Veronica looked him in the eyes and felt something break inside her. Trust. Love. The illusion that there was still something left to save. She turned around and walked to her room, closing the door with a soft click. Ricardo didn't follow her. He didn't try to stop her. And that was the worst of all. The night stretched on in dense silence. Veronica lay in bed, staring at the ceiling without really seeing it. Beside her, Ricardo slept with the obliviousness of someone who believes everything can be resolved over time. She, however, felt the weight of betrayal like a dagger slowly sinking into her chest. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't close her eyes without replaying the morning scene. Marcella, in her silk negligee, sliding her fingers over her husband's skin, whispering poisoned words. And him, motionless, unable to pull away, unable to put a stop to it. She turned in bed, feeling that if she stayed a second longer in that space, she would lose her mind. She got up quietly, with light steps, and left the room. She walked towards the living room, where everything had happened. In the dim light, she could still see Marcella on that sofa, with her insinuating smile, her cheap perfume permeating the air. A shiver ran through her skin. She couldn't stand it anymore. She turned on her phone and checked her messages. No apologies from Ricardo. No explanations. Nothing. Then, without thinking, she headed to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of wine. Not because she wanted to relax, but because she needed to sort out her thoughts. She sat at the table, her gaze fixed on the wood. Something inside her began to take shape, an idea forming deep within her resentment. The next day, the atmosphere in the house was charged. Ricardo looked at her with guilt, but said nothing. He seemed to be waiting for everything to resolve itself, as if silence could erase what had happened. Veronica, on the other hand, had made a decision. She was no longer the woman who bowed her head, no longer the submissive wife who allowed herself to be humiliated. Now, she was someone else. In the afternoon, while Ricardo was showering, his cell phone vibrated on the nightstand. Veronica, who was arranging clothes in the closet, saw it out of the corner of her eye. She didn't usually snoop through his things. She had never been a jealous or paranoid wife. But after what had happened, there was no doubt that too many things were hidden in that house. She picked up the phone and swiped the screen. The message was from Mrs. Rosa. Son, your wife is no longer the pretty young woman you met. You need someone who knows how to treat a real man. Look at her, she can't even give you a child. I want a grandson, and Marcella is a good candidate. Veronica's stomach clenched with sudden nausea. Marcella. This had not been a coincidence. Mrs. Rosa had been operating from the shadows, manipulating Ricardo as if he were a child, poisoning him against her, preparing him to replace her as if she were an old and disposable object. Her breathing became erratic. Pain and anger mixed within her like a corrosive poison. Ricardo came out of the bathroom with a towel around his waist and saw her standing there with the phone in her hand. "What are you doing?" She looked up, filled with a hatred she had never felt before. "Your mother." Ricardo frowned, still not understanding. "What about my mom?" Veronica lifted the phone and showed him the screen. "This." Ricardo read the message in silence. His expression changed from confusion to horror in a matter of seconds. "No, it can't be." "It is." Ricardo closed his eyes and rubbed his face with his hands. "My mom, she." "Don't act surprised, Ricardo. You know perfectly well this isn't new. She's manipulated you all your life, made you believe you can't think for yourself, that you need her to tell you what to do, how to live, who to be with. That's not true." "Really? Then why didn't you stop her when she talked about my body like it was trash? Why didn't you say anything when she hinted that Marcella was a better option for you?" Ricardo opened his mouth, but found no response. Veronica stepped toward him. "She's been poisoning you against me from day one. And you never did anything to stop her." Ricardo lowered his head. For the first time in his life, he looked genuinely ashamed. But it was too late. The idea that had formed in Veronica's mind the night before was now fully formed. It was time to end everything. That same day, she called Mrs. Rosa and invited her to dinner. The old lady, suspecting nothing, accepted eagerly. "I love that you're finally realizing you need to treat me better, dear." Veronica smiled hypocritically. "Of course, mother-in-law. This dinner is for you." When the evening came, the table was set. A pristine tablecloth, candles lit, a delicious scent permeating the air. Ricardo was tense, unsure of what to expect. Mrs. Rosa entered with her haughty demeanor, smiling as if she were entering her own kingdom. "How lovely everything looks, darling." "Thank you, mother-in-law." They sat down. The silence was thick. Veronica picked up her wine glass and twirled it between her fingers. "I wanted to thank you, Mrs. Rosa." The old lady looked at her in surprise. "Thank me?" "Yes, for teaching me a lot." "Oh, dear, how kind. I've always wanted the best for you." Veronica smiled. "I know. That's why I prepared this dinner. Because I wanted to tell you, face to face, that your days of manipulation are over." The old lady's smile froze. Ricardo swallowed hard. Mrs. Rosa blinked. "Excuse me?" Veronica leaned her elbows on the table and interlaced her fingers. "I heard Marcella making advances towards my husband. And then I saw your message." The old lady's face tensed. No, Mrs. Rosa. I'm not interested in what you have to say. Because I already know exactly who you are." Mrs. Rosa straightened up in her chair. "Ricardo, son, say something." Ricardo kept his eyes down. "Ricardo." "Nothing." Mrs. Rosa began to get agitated. "Son, you can't let her talk to me like this." Ricardo looked up. And for the first time in his life, he saw his mother clearly. He saw her selfishness. He saw her cruelty. He saw the way she had played with him for years. "We're moving." The words echoed in the room like thunder. Mrs. Rosa's eyes widened, incredulous. "What?" "We're selling the house and moving away." "No, you can't do this to me." "I can." Veronica smiled, relishing the panic that settled in the old lady's eyes. "I won't let you interfere in my life anymore." Mrs. Rosa slammed her hand on the table. "I'm your mother, Ricardo." He looked at her coldly. "And I'm an adult man." Mrs. Rosa trembled with fury. "You're going to leave me alone." Ricardo stood up from the table. "You left yourself alone." Veronica also stood up. "I suggest you find another way to entertain yourself, Mrs. Rosa. Because we're leaving." The old lady remained petrified. She couldn't believe it. After so many years of manipulation, mental games, absolute control, she had finally lost. Weeks later, the shadows of the past do not disappear with a change of address. It is not enough to pack things up, sell the house, and take a different path. Some wounds, some scars, remain etched on the skin and in memory as a cruel reminder of what once was. The car moved down the highway in an almost unsettling silence. Veronica gazed out the window at the rapidly changing landscape, buildings turning into open fields, city lights shrinking to distant dots in the rearview mirror. Ricardo held the steering wheel with both hands firmly. He wasn't talking. Since they left the apartment that morning, he hadn't spoken more than 3 sentences in a row. The backseat was filled with suitcases. They hadn't told anyone. They hadn't left any farewell letters. They had simply vanished. The sale of the apartment had closed quicker than they had expected. Ricardo didn't question the decision. He didn't ask for time to think. He knew that if he did, his mother would find a way to worm her way back into his mind, to entangle him with her words, to convince him he was making a mistake. Veronica took a deep breath and closed her eyes. They had done it. They were far away. Finally, they were free. The first few weeks were strange. The new house was smaller, but it had something the apartment never had: peace. There were no unexpected visits. No criticisms disguised as advice. No insinuations, no mocking, no incessant calls at all hours of the day. Ricardo tried to adjust to the new life. He had grown up under the shadow of a woman who made him feel incapable of making decisions on his own. Now, in this new stage, he had to learn what it truly meant to be an independent man. Veronica, on the other hand, thrived. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was breathing without someone's weight on her shoulders. She woke up in the mornings without the fear of hearing her mother-in-law's condescending tone, without the anxiety of discovering that her husband had been manipulated again. It seemed everything was in order. Until the phone rang. Ricardo stared at it before answering. He knew who it was without even looking at the screen. "Son," Donna Rosa's voice sounded weak, broken. "How could you leave me alone?" Ricardo closed his eyes. "Mom, I'm sick." Her tone became more dramatic. "I feel bad. I don't know what I'll do without you." Veronica watched the scene from the table, her jaw clenched. "Mom, you always manipulate with your health. This time I won't fall for your game." Donna Rosa sobbed. "I'm not lying. I'm weak. I have no one. Are you really going to let me die alone?" Ricardo felt a pang in his chest. Donna Rosa had always known how to press the exact buttons to make her son fall into her net. From a young age, she made him feel responsible for her happiness, as if his entire life depended on him being by her side, obedient, submissive, available. But this time, something inside him resisted. He looked at Veronica. She said nothing, but her expression said it all. It was time to choose. The silence stretched on. Donna Rosa, on the other end of the phone, waited for her son's response with the certainty that she had him in her hands. But Ricardo, for the first time in his life, stood firm. "Mom, we're not coming back." The old woman fell silent. "What did you say?" "What you heard. We're not coming back." A grunt of disbelief came through the line. "You can't do this to me. I'm your mother. And I am an adult man." Donna Rosa's voice turned cold. "Veronica has filled your head with nonsense." Ricardo felt the anger boiling inside him. "Veronica has done nothing but endure all the things you put her through. If anyone has filled my head with nonsense, it's you." The silence on the other end was broken by a bitter laugh. "Sooner or later, you'll realize the mistake you've made." "I don't think so." Veronica stepped forward and gently took the phone from his hands with calculated delicacy. "Maybe you should ask Marcella for help," she said with a sweet, almost mocking tone. "After all, you get along so well with her." The sound of Donna Rosa's contained breathing filtered through the handset. "You're a wretch." Veronica smiled. "How nice that we can finally tell each other things face to face, isn't it?" She hung up before the old woman could respond. Ricardo looked at her in silence. Was that too much? Veronica placed the phone on the table calmly. No, Ricardo. It was just right. He sighed and rubbed his face with his hands. She's my mother. Yes, and she hurt you. Ricardo didn't respond. He knew Veronica was right. The night fell and the house remained calm. Veronica made tea while Ricardo looked out the window, lost in his thoughts. Do you regret it? Ricardo turned his head and looked her in the eyes. No. Veronica passed him a cup and sat beside him. You still think about her? Yes. She took a sip of her tea. That's normal. Ricardo let out a humorless laugh. It's ironic. For years I thought that if I pleased her, if I did everything she wanted, if I proved I was a good son, one day she would give me her approval. And she never did. He shook his head. Veronica rested her head on his shoulder. Sometimes, to find peace, you have to close the doors that harm us, even if those doors bear the names of our own family. Ricardo sighed and intertwined his fingers with hers. I know. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was breathing without his mother's shadow over him. It had been hard, but finally, they were free. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to leave in the comments what you felt upon hearing it, and if you have gone through a similar deception situation, I would love for you to share your valuable opinion. I would be very honored if you leave a like, share the video with a friend or family member, and subscribe to the channel. Do not miss the next amazing story that is appearing on your screen at this moment. We have guaranteed entertainment exclusively for you. See you in the next video.